Well, we've got a great case study here. Why don't you talk us through that, John?
Yeah, Cineplex Entertainment is a really great case study. They started building a composable solution back in 2008. So before, cloud was big, before composable was anything, but they had the mindset of a composable architecture on day one. The idea was they would roll out different components over time, best of breed kind of components. And what it allowed them to do was, silo those things and allow them to take in and out different parts. So they could replace the front end, they could replace parts of the back end, they could change or add e-com, expand to new platforms. And over time, it really followed the composable model, even though that wasn't even really an architecture back in the day. So since 2008, they've rebuilt their front end 5 different times. And right now, I'm just talking about their .com website, but they have a whole bunch of different sites that follow this model. But the main .com site, which is their main kind of theater, movie, Showtime site, they rebuilt that front end 5 times, including changing programming languages from .NET, Next.js. And during that period, when they had to rebuild that front end, they did not have to change anything on the back end. So they
Right.
kept the same platforms. At the same time, they also changed all of their platforms. They've changed search, they've changed analytics, e-commerce layers, and more over the years. And they've looked at those as micro projects. So they've said, you know what, we're going to do search and optimize that, and we're going to focus on that and replace it or swap it out. They're going to use, okay, now we're going to do the e-commerce layer and we're going to beef it up or do something there. They even added apps at a completely different time, and rolled those into sharing the same content and pulling that same content in. So it's a really great case study where they've been able to be nimble, they've been able to adjust over the years, they've been able to make things smaller projects. And the other benefit to that is they've allowed different teams to work on those projects. So
Right.
sometimes they do it internally, sometimes they hire an agency for all these different components, and they're able to bring that team in, work on a component of a pretty large ecosystem, and just silo into that one area and say, we're going to replace the apps or we're going to do this. And how they've done it, which is kind of leading into our next webinar that we have early December on orchestration. They actually built a orchestration layer for their content and how their content gets sent between different areas. So they built a custom orchestration layer because obviously, 2008 to 2012, in that time when they built that, there was no orchestration layers out. Now there is, and our next webinar talks a little bit how that fits into the composable model. But they built a custom one, and it's really been amazing for them to be able to add and remove things.
I want to dig into a couple aspects here, John, because you just covered a ton of material. So
Sorry.
the first question I would ask, and I think I have some insight into this because I remember also I remember the movie that came out when their first version launched with agility. I think it was like Spider-Man 3. So if you can think of eras, that's like it's pre-cloud, it's like pre-Marvel movies kind of thing, and Spider-Man 3 was the biggest one with Tobey Maguire.
Pre-responsiveness, responsive sites, and
Oh yeah.
like you have different mobile site than your desktop site. Like it's crazy.
Right. And I think one of the biggest problems they were trying to solve was a couple things. One was when folks are out in Vancouver in a different time zone, we want to make sure that the time is on the site and makes sense for when they buy a ticket because things were getting messed up with time zones. And
Yeah.
their current monolithic solution couldn't handle that. And they wanted to have more control over ticketing, online ticketing, because that was kind of a new thing. And they didn't want to have to charge an extra fee for online ticketing, and they wanted to kind of bring that in house and customize that layer. And so just in the idea of, we're monolithic, but we need to split off some of these pieces of logic, that led to the conversation of how to get to this solution. And then over time, I think one of the biggest things is like that orchestration layer, because they understood that folks are going to want to use the app, especially coming back to it all the time. We want to get them to log into the app all the time. So we want to have fresh content that's on there, but also feed in the showtimes and merge all of this data into one kind of stream. And we actually worked on that with them. And so I think it's really interesting to talk about like how to build up experience with these kind of things, because this is something that we've worked on with Cineplex since, well, before the days when agility was pure SaaS. We actually built their website, the first version of it. But then they contracted in when they moved over to Next.js, right? They hired a company to help them learn that new ecosystem.
Yeah.
But I think they brought all that back in house now, right?
No, they still work with agencies and things like that, but that's the great thing. Some components are in-house, some are external, and you can do that when you can silo out and separate these platforms and work on them independently.
Right.
I think the cherry on top of this whole case study is just looking at the time frame during COVID.
Right.
So you can think of a theater complex like this and how difficult COVID can be, shutting down all the face-to-face things. So all the theaters were shut down. How does a company like this handle a situation like that? And this is really where we saw that composable architecture really come shine through in terms of the benefits. So what they decided to do, number one, was let's look at another silo project and improve it. So that was around the time when they moved to Next.js. They optimized the front end. They did those things like that. So they didn't have to do a huge, big project in terms of replacing platforms. They're just going to retool a certain section. So they focused on projects because they couldn't do a lot of other things with the theaters closed. The other thing is they were able to pivot their business, their complete business model. So Cineplex does have streaming of movies, online streaming. They have online sales and things like that as well. They pivoted and really beefed up those areas of the business. So their e-commerce shifted, their store site shifted. That became more of a highlight, and they were able to very quickly pivot and focus on those as a business that normally focuses primarily on face-to-face in theater, movies and pop and popcorn, right? So very, very different business model. And although they had a little bit of that before, they were able to pivot very quickly and beef that component of revenue up for them in their business. So it just shows how agile, it made them as a business, having that kind of architecture where they could just, come over here and focus on that one area.
Now, there's one other aspect that I didn't even talk to you about yet, John, but it came up in a conversation last week with some folks from Europe who were really interested in talking about sustainability with technology. And one of the side effects of some of the move to more composable and adjusting front end platforms that I know happened with Cineplex is I guarantee you their basically carbon footprint has dropped tremendously with regards to hosting their website, because I know they were on a server rendered website before. And I know that around Friday at 4 p.m., when everyone started searching for movies, that those CPUs would crank up, and they had a ton of server hardware that was dedicated on premise to serve that. Now they've moved to more of a cloud strategy with a statically rendered, dynamically updated website where, like, first of all, the cost is a lot lower for hosting a site like that, but also the carbon footprint of the website is much, much less. So there's just another benefit in terms of sustainability from a technology side of things.
Yeah. Yeah, and people could argue you can have that architecture with a monolithic system and you can tack that on the front, but it's not meant, like most composable solutions are meant from the ground up to be that type of architecture. Right. So we've seen a huge shift to that kind of Jamstack, front end rendered type of direction.
Right.
Sure.
So great case study. I love talking about it.
Yeah. Perfect example of composable gone right.